Before Emily Carter walked out of the glass office tower for the last time, she had only two things left: a small savings account and the sinking feeling that she had traded the best years of her life for endless meetings and quarterly reports. At 35, she did something that shocked everyone who knew her. She quit her corporate career forever, packed everything she still owned into her SUV, and drove hundreds of miles north to buy a forgotten ice harvest house beside a frozen lake for just $100. When the auctioneer brought down his gavel, laughter echoed through the room. Some people whispered that she'd completely lost her mind. Those wondered how anyone could throw away a successful career for a collapsing wooden building that hadn't been useful in nearly a century. Emily ignored every stare because she believed she was buying herself a second chance. 3 weeks later, while replacing rotted floorboards inside the abandoned ice house, her pry bar struck something hollow beneath the timber. Hidden below the floor was a sealed compartment that appeared on no blueprint and had been untouched for decades. Inside rested an old wooden box wrapped in worn canvas. As she brushed away the dust, she uncovered a weathered notebook stamped with two faded words: Winter Work Journal. The moment she opened the cover, she realized someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure these journals would never be found. But what was written inside those pages, and why had an entire chapter of the town's history been buried beneath the ice house for so many years? That's where our story begins. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. If you're starting your morning, I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. If you're relaxing at the end of a long day, thank you for spending part of your evening here with me. Leave a comment below to join the conversation. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten places, hidden family legacies, and life-changing discoveries, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next journey. Emily Carter stared at her reflection in the polished elevator doors as they carried her down from the 23rd floor for what she had promised herself would be the last time. The woman looking back wore the same tailored navy suit she had worn to hundreds of meetings, yet her eyes belonged to someone else entirely. She had spent 12 years climbing the corporate ladder in Chicago, earning promotions that looked impressive on paper while quietly losing every hobby, every friendship, and every reason she had once loved waking up in the morning. Just an hour earlier, another budget meeting had ended with executives arguing over numbers that would be forgotten by next quarter. As voices echoed around the conference room, Emily had realized she couldn't remember the last time anyone talked about people instead of profits. Something inside her simply stopped fighting. She walked back to her office, typed a brief resignation letter, placed her company laptop beside the keyboard, and left without looking back. Her phone buzzed nonstop as coworkers called and texted, but she muted every notification before loading the last few boxes into her aging SUV. By sunset, the Chicago skyline had disappeared in her rearview mirror, replaced by long stretches of highway leading north. For the first time in years, she had no meetings on her calendar, no deadlines waiting on Monday, and no idea what came next. During the following week, Emily drove through small towns across Minnesota searching for a place where life moved slower. Most properties she visited were either too expensive or needed repairs she couldn't afford. Then she noticed a tiny listing buried among county tax auction notices. Former ice harvest house, abandoned, minimum bid $100. There was only one faded photograph showing a weathered wooden building beside a frozen lake. The roof sagged beneath heavy snow. Several windows were boarded shut, and the paint had nearly vanished beneath decades of harsh winters. It looked forgotten, which somehow made it impossible for Emily to ignore. The county auction attracted only a handful of people. Most were local contractors hoping to buy land for future development. When the old building appeared on the list, the auctioneer glanced around the nearly empty room. $100, Do I hear 100? Emily slowly raised her bidder card. A man near the back chuckled. Another whispered, "Someone's buying that old ice shed." No one offered another bid. The auctioneer shrugged, struck his gavel once, and announced the sale. Laughter spread across the room as Emily signed the paperwork. One gray-haired man shook his head before leaving. "You'll spend more hauling it away than it's worth." Emily smiled politely, though part of her wondered if they were right. Still, something about the abandoned building felt different from every polished office she had left behind. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't profitable. But it was real. 2 days later, she reached the property just before sunset. Snow blanketed the shoreline, and the frozen lake stretched toward a line of silent pine trees. The ice harvest house leaned slightly with age, its thick timber walls darkened by decades of winter storms. A rusted metal pulley still hung above the wide entrance, where enormous blocks of ice had once been pulled inside. The wind carried only the sound of distant crows and the creaking of old wood settling in the cold. Emily unlocked the weathered front door with the key provided by the county. Dust floated through the pale afternoon light, filtering between broken boards covering the windows. Inside, abandoned tools rested exactly where someone had left them many years before. Wooden beams crossed the ceiling, and the smell of aged pine mixed with cold air trapped inside the empty structure. She set down her backpack and slowly walked through each room, imagining the workers who had once filled the building with conversation and hard labor every winter. The silence felt heavy, but strangely comforting. Before leaving for the small motel where she planned to stay until the house became livable, Emily made one final walk around the interior with a flashlight. Near the back corner, she noticed a thick wooden door built into the floor. An old iron ring served as its handle, but when she pulled, nothing moved. She tried again with both hands. The door remained firmly locked from below. Kneeling closer, she brushed away years of dust and noticed faint scratches around its edges, as if someone had opened it many times long ago before sealing it shut. She rested her hand on the cold wood, listening to the building settle in the evening frost. Then, somewhere beneath the floor, she heard a single dull sound that made her freeze. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Something had moved below her feet. The following morning, Emily returned to the ice harvest house before sunrise with a thermos of coffee, a toolbox, heavy gloves, and more determination than experience. Overnight snow had covered her tire tracks, making it feel as though the old building had been waiting only for her. She unlocked the front door, inhaled the crisp air trapped inside, and began the slow process of clearing away decades of neglect. Broken crates, rusted hooks, splintered shelves, and piles of fallen boards filled nearly every corner. Dust coated every surface, and each sweep of her broom stirred tiny clouds that sparkled in the pale winter light. The work was exhausting, but unlike the endless spreadsheets she had left behind, every hour produced something she could actually see. By midday, she had uncovered most of the original wooden floor and stacked reusable lumber against one wall. Her shoulders ached, yet she found herself smiling for the first time in months. Around noon, the sound of a pickup truck interrupted the silence. Emily stepped outside and saw a man climbing out with a toolbox in one hand. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a faded canvas jacket dusted with sawdust. "You must be the new owner," he called. "I'm Noah Anderson. I build and repair just about everything around here." Emily introduced herself, expecting another lecture about buying a worthless property. Instead, Noah studied the sagging roof before speaking. "You've got a leak above the east corner. If another heavy snowfall comes before that's fixed, you'll lose part of the roof." Emily glanced upward. "I figured there'd be problems." "There are plenty," Noah answered with a faint grin. But old timber like this is worth saving if someone has the patience. Together, they climbed onto the roof, carefully replacing loose boards and securing a torn section with temporary plywood until proper materials could arrive. Noah worked with practiced confidence, while Emily followed his instructions. Learning how each beam supported the next, they spoke little at first. But as the afternoon passed, he asked why someone from Chicago had come all this way to buy an abandoned ice house. Emily hesitated before answering honestly. I spent years building the life everyone said I should want. One day I realized I couldn't remember why I wanted it. Noah nodded without judgment. Small towns have a way of giving people room to hear themselves think again. Before leaving, he handed her the name of a local hardware supplier. Ben Lawson owns the place. Tell him I sent you. He'll complain about your project, but he'll still sell you what you need. After Noah drove away, Emily stopped at the town's only cafe for a late lunch. Most conversations paused briefly as she entered, curiosity replacing suspicion. An elderly woman sitting alone by the window smiled and motioned toward the empty chair across from her. "You're the woman who bought the ice house," she said warmly. Emily laughed. News travels fast. It always has around here. I'm Martha Olson. I taught history for nearly 40 years. When Emily mentioned hearing about the building's past, Martha's eyes brightened. People today forget how important ice harvesting once was. Before electric refrigerators, entire communities depended on winter. Men cut enormous blocks from the frozen lake, stored them inside insulated buildings, and shipped them across the region through the warmer months. That old ice house wasn't just a warehouse. It kept food fresh, supplied businesses, and gave families steady work every winter. Emily listened carefully. So why was it abandoned? Martha stirred her tea thoughtfully. Time changes everything. Once modern refrigeration arrived, the work disappeared faster than anyone expected. Most people moved on. Memories faded. Before they parted, Martha smiled kindly. If you ever discover anything unusual inside that building, I'd enjoy seeing it. Emily spent the remainder of the afternoon buying cleaning supplies and basic tools from Ben Lawson's hardware store. The owner glanced at her shopping cart before shaking his head. You're putting money into that old place? Trying to. Hope you're not expecting a profit. Emily simply smiled. I'm hoping for a fresh start. Ben shrugged as he rang up the purchase. Good luck. You'll need it. Back at the property, she decided it was finally time to deal with the heavy wooden hatch set into the floor. The strange sound she had heard the previous evening lingered in her thoughts, though she suspected it had been nothing more than old wood shifting in the cold. After removing layers of dirt packed around the edges, she sprayed penetrating oil onto the rusted hinges and waited patiently. Then she wedged a pry bar beneath the iron ring and leaned her weight against it. At first, nothing happened. She tried again, this time with both feet planted firmly against the floorboards. A loud crack echoed through the room as the old seal finally broke. Cold air rushed upward from the darkness below. Emily aimed her flashlight into the opening and saw a narrow staircase disappearing beneath the building. Carefully descending one step at a time, she found herself inside a surprisingly large underground storage room. Thick stone walls still held the winter chill. Empty wooden racks lined one side, reminders of the massive ice blocks once stored there. Near the far wall sat a weathered cedar chest covered with dust and a thin layer of frost. Its iron latch had rusted almost completely away. Emily knelt beside it, brushed off decades of dirt, and slowly lifted the heavy lid. Inside rested neatly stacked bundles wrapped in faded cloth. She unfolded the top layer with trembling hands and revealed an old, leather-bound notebook. Pressed into its worn cover were 4 faded words: Winter Work Journal. Emily carried the journal upstairs as though it were made of glass instead of worn leather. She brushed the dust from an old workbench near the window, lit a camping lantern as the winter afternoon faded, and carefully opened the brittle cover. The first page was written in neat cursive, the ink browned with age but still remarkably clear. At the top, one name stood alone: Clara Jensen. Winter Work Journal, January 7, 1918. Emily read the opening lines slowly. Father says every winter begins with silence. Before the saws, before the horses, before the men gather on the lake, there is only the sound of the wind reminding us that ice belongs to no one. Emily smiled despite herself. She had expected inventory records or shipping numbers, not words that sounded almost poetic. She turned another page. Clara described waking before dawn while the stars still filled the sky. Her brothers and the other workers hauled long saws, iron hooks, ropes, and wooden sleds onto the frozen lake before sunrise. They checked the thickness of the ice every morning because one mistake could send a man into freezing water that few survived. Emily paused, picturing the frozen lake outside her own window. It suddenly looked less peaceful than it had the day before. The journal continued with remarkable detail. Clara explained how crews first cleared snow from the lake before marking perfect grids across the ice. Long saws followed the lines until enormous rectangular blocks floated free. Horses pulled the blocks toward narrow channels where workers guided them with hooked poles before lifting them into the ice harvest house using the overhead pulley Emily had noticed outside. Reading the pages while sitting inside the very building Clara described made every sentence feel alive. Emily glanced toward the ceiling, imagining the heavy timbers groaning beneath the weight of freshly cut ice more than a century earlier. The building no longer seemed abandoned. It simply felt quiet as darkness settled outside. Emily made coffee on a portable camping stove and continued reading. Clara rarely wrote about herself directly. Instead, she described the people around her. One entry mentioned young boys learning to sharpen blades. Another praised an older worker who could judge the thickness of ice by sound alone. She even recorded the names of horses that pulled the sleds across the frozen lake. Emily found herself caring about people she had never met simply because Clara noticed the small moments others might have ignored. Early the next morning, Emily carried the journal to Martha Olson's house. The retired teacher welcomed her inside before Emily even reached the porch, as though she had been expecting a visit. When Emily placed the notebook on the kitchen table, Martha adjusted her glasses and stared at the cover in disbelief. "I haven't seen anything like this before," she whispered. Together, they carefully examined several pages. Martha smiled as she recognized familiar family names that still existed around town. "These journals are extraordinary," she said. "Most records from the ice harvesting years focused on business. This is different. Clara wrote about people." Emily nodded. "It feels like she wanted someone to remember them." Martha agreed quietly. Perhaps she did. After lunch, Emily returned to the ice harvest house, carrying photocopies Martha had made so the fragile journal could remain safely inside. She spent the afternoon cleaning another section of the main floor while occasionally stopping to reread passages. The more she worked, the easier it became to imagine where workers had stacked tools or gathered to warm their hands. Every board she swept clean revealed another small reminder that real lives had once filled the building. Near sunset, she discovered a folded sheet tucked inside the back cover of the journal. Unlike the handwritten pages, it was a carefully drawn map of the frozen lake and surrounding shoreline. Several locations were marked with small symbols and handwritten notes identifying old cutting lanes, storage routes, and loading points. One narrow path stretched from the ice harvest house across the lake, before disappearing into the woods beyond the opposite shore. Emily wasn't sure whether any trace of it still existed. The next morning, Noah arrived with lumber for the roof repairs. Emily showed him the map while they worked side by side, replacing damaged boards. He studied it for several moments before pointing toward the northern shoreline. "That trail actually existed when my grandfather was a boy," he said. "He used to talk about old wagon paths crossing the ice every winter. Most disappeared decades ago, but parts of them might still be visible once the snow melts." Emily looked from the map to the frozen lake outside. "So Clara wasn't exaggerating," Noah smiled. "People around here depended on winter more than outsiders realize." His words made Emily appreciate the journal even more. It wasn't simply telling stories. It was preserving a way of life that had almost vanished. That evening she returned to the workbench and carefully turned to the next section. Clara's writing continued without interruption for several weeks, describing colder weather, harder work, and growing friendships among the crews. Then Emily reached a page where the story ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence. She frowned and turned to the next sheet. It was missing. So was the one after it. Several pages had been cleanly removed from the journal long ago. She slowly flipped through the remaining entries, hoping they had simply loosened and fallen elsewhere. But the torn binding made the truth impossible to ignore. Someone had deliberately taken part of Clara's story. Emily closed the journal gently, staring at the uneven edge where the missing pages should have been. Emily spent the next morning searching every corner of the ice harvest house for the missing journal pages. She checked beneath loose floorboards, inside cracked wooden crates, and between stacks of old lumber that had not been moved in decades. Every dusty box raised her hopes for a moment, before revealing nothing more than rusted hardware or broken tools. By noon, she leaned against one of the thick support beams, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the freezing air. Whoever had removed those pages had done it long before the building was abandoned. They had not simply fallen out with age. Someone had carefully torn them away. The thought stayed with her as she locked the building and drove into town to visit Martha. The retired teacher listened patiently while Emily described the missing section. Martha wasn't surprised. "Old journals often lose pages," she said at first. Then she examined the binding through a magnifying glass and slowly shook her head. "Not like this. These weren't damaged. They were removed on purpose." Emily sighed. "Do you think whatever was written there mattered that much?" Martha carefully closed the journal. "If someone wanted to erase part of Clara's story, then yes." The answer brought more questions than comfort, but Emily appreciated Martha's honesty. Before leaving, Martha disappeared into another room and returned carrying a flat cardboard folder. Inside was an old black and white photograph protected by clear plastic. Emily immediately recognized the ice harvest house standing proudly beside the frozen lake. Looking almost new, dozens of men posed in front of the wide entrance wearing thick wool coats and heavy boots. Several horses stood nearby, attached to sleds loaded with enormous blocks of ice. Emily studied every face until Martha pointed toward a young woman standing beside an older man. "I believe that's Clara Jensen," she said quietly. Emily smiled at the photograph. Clara looked confident rather than serious, her gloved hand resting on one of the ice hooks while everyone around her faced the camera. Seeing her face transformed the journal into something even more personal. She was no longer just a voice on faded paper. She had been a real woman, standing outside the very building Emily now owned. Martha turned the photograph over. Faint handwriting listed nearly every worker's name. Emily recognized several surnames that still appeared on mailboxes around town. "Families stay here for generations," Martha said. "Sometimes history survives simply because people refuse to leave." Emily thanked her and promised to return the photograph after making a copy. On the drive back, she stopped at Ben Lawson's hardware store to buy stronger pry bars, replacement hinges, and screws for the continuing repairs. Ben scanned the items while watching her with quiet curiosity. "Still working on that old place?" he asked. "Every day." He nodded toward the photograph tucked beneath her arm. "Found something interesting?" Emily hesitated before showing him the picture. Ben studied it for a long moment. "My grandfather talked about those harvest crews when I was a kid. Hard to believe this many people worked out there every winter." He handed the photograph back. "Years ago, somebody offered to buy that property, planned to tear the building down and build vacation cabins." Emily looked up. "What happened?" "The deal never came together. Too much work," they said. Ben shrugged. "Most folks figured the building would eventually collapse on its own." Emily left the store thinking about how close the ice harvest house had come to disappearing forever. If that sale had happened, Clara's journal would likely have been destroyed beneath a bulldozer. Without anyone knowing it existed back at the building, she decided to inspect the old furniture that remained inside. Against one wall stood a heavy wooden desk coated with dust and missing one drawer. She had ignored it during cleanup because the worked wood appeared beyond saving. Now she examined it more carefully. The craftsmanship was surprisingly detailed, with hand-carved edges worn smooth by countless years of use. Every drawer held only scraps of paper, broken pencils, and rusted nails. Just as she prepared to move on, her hand brushed against the underside of the desktop. Something felt uneven. Kneeling beside the desk, Emily tapped along the bottom until she heard a faint, hollow sound. She ran her fingers across the wood and discovered a nearly invisible seam. Using the tip of her pocket knife, she gently lifted a narrow, hidden panel no wider than her hand. Inside rested a single folded envelope protected from dust by the secret compartment. The paper had yellowed with age, but the wax seal had long since broken. Emily unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting matched Clara's journal. It contained only a few short lines. "If this reaches the right hands, remember that every winter tells its own story, but there is one story that cannot be understood without the final winter." Emily read the closing words twice. There was no explanation, no date, and no signature beyond Clara's familiar initials. She quietly folded the letter again, realizing it offered one small answer while opening an even larger question. What had happened during the final winter? Emily carried Clara's letter to Martha the next morning, protecting it inside a folder beneath her coat as snow swept across the road. Martha read the short message twice at her kitchen table, then placed it beside the journal and stared toward the window. "The final winter," she murmured. That phrase must refer to the last season the harvest crews worked the lake. Emily opened the journal to the section after the torn pages. The remaining entries had changed in tone. Clara's earlier descriptions of sharpened saws, strong horses, and crowded loading platforms gave way to shorter notes about reduced crews and uncertain orders. One entry mentioned a new electric refrigeration unit installed at a grocery warehouse in a nearby town. Another recorded that 2 longtime customers had canceled their summer ice deliveries. This wasn't just a bad season, Emily said. The entire trade was disappearing. Martha nodded. Electric refrigerators did not arrive everywhere at once, but once businesses trusted them, the old ice companies had little time to adapt. Emily read aloud from an entry dated January 12, 1929. Clara described 16 men gathering before dawn where nearly 40 had worked in earlier years. Some had already left for mills, rail yards, or farms farther west. The remaining crew cut fewer channels across the lake because the orders no longer justified a full harvest. Clara wrote that the silence between the men felt heavier than the winter air. By noon, Emily and Martha had arranged the entries chronologically. Though the torn pages interrupted part of the account, the surviving records made one fact clear. Clara knew the ice harvest house was approaching its final season, yet she continued documenting each task with care. She listed repairs to the pulley, measured the thickness of the lake ice, and noted every worker who reported for duty. She even recorded small acts that had nothing to do with production. A shared lunch, a repaired glove, a horse covered with an extra blanket during a storm. She was preserving more than a business. Emily said, she was preserving the people. Martha's expression softened. Perhaps she understood that ordinary lives are the first things history forgets. Back at the ice harvest house, Emily found Noah replacing damaged boards near the eastern wall. She showed him copies of the later journal entries while he rested his hammer against a beam. "My grandfather said the last harvest changed the town," Noah told her. Families depended on that winter income. When the work ended, some left within months. Emily looked across the empty floor. She imagined the building crowded for one final season. Everyone aware that the next winter might bring no work at all. Clara stayed. She said, "At least long enough to keep writing." Noah examined a line describing the storage room. "She mentions workers gathering inside after shifts. This place may have served as more than a warehouse." Emily reread the passage. Clara had written about hot coffee being passed around, children waiting for fathers, and neighbors collecting small pieces of ice for household use. Another entry described a local woman bringing soup after a worker injured his hand. The ice harvest house had been a practical center of community life, not merely a building where frozen blocks were stacked. That realization changed the way Emily approached the repairs. She stopped seeing only rotted boards and cracked hinges. Each damaged surface had once supported the daily lives Clara recorded. When Ben delivered a box of screws that afternoon, Emily showed him the passage about the final crew. He recognized 2 surnames and stood quietly beside the old desk. "Those families still live around here," he said. "No one talks about the ice harvest anymore. That's why the journal matters," Emily replied. Ben glanced around the building before leaving. "Then I suppose the place matters too." The comment was brief, but it carried none of his earlier dismissal. After sunset, Emily worked alone at the old workbench, reading deeper into Clara's final entries. The weather that winter had been unpredictable. A January thaw weakened part of the lake, forcing the crew to move their cutting lanes farther north. Orders continued to decline. One foreman left after receiving work at a grain elevator. Another man stayed only because his family needed money for heating coal. Clara's handwriting remained controlled, but disappointment pressed through every sentence. In a late February entry, she described the final large blocks entering the building. The pulley groaned overhead as the men guided the last load into storage. No one celebrated. They simply stood together in the cold, reluctant to admit an era had ended. Emily stopped reading and listened to the wind pressing against the restored section of roof. For years, she had believed leaving corporate life meant abandoning everything she had worked to build. Clara's words revealed a different kind of loss, an entire community watching its shared purpose disappear through no fault of its own. Emily understood why the final winter mattered emotionally, but the missing pages still concealed its greatest significance. She turned to the last readable entry in the journal. Clara wrote that the house had once belonged to everyone who depended on it, whether they cut the ice, carried the blocks, delivered food to the workers, or waited at home for wages. She feared that once the work vanished, the people would vanish from memory with it. The next paragraph was written more heavily, as though Clara had pressed the pen hard into the page. "There are records that must not be placed in the office ledger. They tell what the harvest truly provided and who depended upon it when no one else would help. I cannot leave them where they may be discarded, altered, or taken." Emily's pulse quickened. She leaned closer to the lantern and read the final line. "Before this house closes." I will hide what matters most beneath the place where winter has always been kept. Emily returned to the ice harvest house before dawn with Clara's final sentence repeating in her mind beneath the place where winter had always been kept. She stood alone in the underground storage room, sweeping her flashlight across the empty racks, stone walls, and frost-darkened floor. The cedar chest had already yielded the first journal, but Clara's words suggested something deeper, something deliberately placed below the storage area itself. Emily began by clearing every loose board and broken crate from the room. She tapped the floor with the handle of her pry bar, listening for any change in sound. Most sections answered with the solid thud of wood laid over packed earth. Near the rear wall, however, one narrow row of boards sounded sharper and more hollow. The difference was subtle enough that she almost dismissed it. She tapped again. The hollow knock returned. When Noah arrived later that morning, he found Emily kneeling beside the wall, brushing dirt from the seams between the planks. "You've been down here since sunrise, haven't you?" he asked. "Clara said she hid something beneath where winter was kept." Emily pointed to the floor. "This section sounds different." Noah tested several boards himself, then examined the square-headed nails securing them. "These were added after the rest of the floor," he said. "Same kind of wood, but the cuts don't match." Together they removed the nails slowly to avoid splitting the aged boards. The first plank resisted until Noah worked a thin pry bar beneath its edge. When it finally lifted, a rush of colder air escaped from the narrow gap. Emily aimed her flashlight into the opening and saw a shallow cavity beneath the floor. At first it appeared empty, then the beam caught the dull edge of metal. They removed 2 more boards, revealing a rectangular box fitted tightly between the foundation supports. Its surface was dark with age, but showed little rust. A strip of hardened cloth had been wrapped around the lid, and thick wax sealed the edges. She protected it from moisture. Noah said. Emily reached down, but the box barely moved. Years of settling earth held it in place. They worked around it with a small shovel, loosening frozen soil 1 careful inch at a time. The cramped space forced them to stop often, and Emily's fingers grew numb despite her gloves. After nearly an hour, the box shifted. Noah gripped one handle while Emily took the other, and together they raised it onto the wooden floor. Neither spoke for several seconds. The box was not large enough to contain money or equipment, yet it was far heavier than Emily expected. The wax around the lid bore several faint impressions, pressed by a simple round seal. Emily recognized the initials from Clara's hidden letter C. J. They carried the box upstairs and placed it on the old workbench. Emily called Martha, who arrived 20 minutes later carrying archival paper, cotton gloves, and a camera. She stared at the sealed container with open astonishment. "Whatever is inside has probably been closed for almost a century," she said. Noah used a narrow blade to loosen the brittle wax without damaging the metal. When the final strip broke free, Emily lifted the lid. The scent of old paper and cedar rose from inside. Several leather-bound journals filled most of the box, each wrapped separately in oilcloth. Beneath them lay bundles of folded documents tied with cotton string. The protection had worked. Though the paper had yellowed, it was dry and remarkably intact. Emily unfolded the first journal. Clara's handwriting appeared on the opening page, followed by a date from an earlier winter than the journal found in the cedar chest. A second volume covered another year, then a third. Martha counted 7 journals in all. She documented season after season. She whispered. Emily turned through the pages and found familiar descriptions of lake conditions, work crews, equipment repairs, and shipments. Yet between those entries were brief notes marked with small circles in the margins. Some contained family names. Others listed quantities of ice followed by words such as milk, medicine, meat, or summer delivery. Noah leaned closer. Those don't look like business orders. Martha opened one of the document bundles. Inside were narrow sheets arranged alphabetically. Each line contained a name, a household location, and a series of dates. Some entries had only one date. Others continued across several years. Emily began reading the names aloud. There were dozens on the first few sheets alone. Widows, laborers, shopkeepers, farm families, and people identified only by a surname or a road. Noah recognized several names still common in town. Martha recognized even more from old school records and cemetery markers. They opened another bundle and found additional lists, each written with the same careful precision. By late afternoon, the documents covered the entire workbench. Hundreds of names appeared across them. Clara had recorded far more people than could have worked for the ice company. Emily compared one sheet with an ordinary shipment ledger found in the desk. The company ledger listed paying customers, commercial deliveries, and amounts due. Clara's hidden lists contained no prices at all. Instead, beside many names, she had written short explanations. Child ill. Seller failed. No income after accident. Milk for infant. Medicine through August. Emily felt the meaning settle over her slowly. These were not ordinary customers. The ice had gone to families who needed it, often for reasons that had nothing to do with business. She opened another journal and found an entry describing a delivery made after dark so a household would not be embarrassed in front of its neighbors. A later note mentioned storing medicine without charge for a woman whose husband had been injured. Clara had concealed the records because they documented help that never appeared in the official books. Martha rested one hand on the table. This is a history of the town no one knew existed. Emily looked over the hundreds of names, the years of quiet deliveries, and the careful notes written between ordinary work reports. The volumes had been labeled winter work journals, but she finally understood they recorded far more than winter work. For 3 days, Emily, Martha, and Noah worked through Clara's records one sheet at a time. The ice harvest house became a temporary archive. Journals rested on clean cloth. Name lists were arranged by year, and fragile pages were copied into labeled folders. Martha brought old town directories and school records, helping them connect Clara's entries to real households. The first clear match was the Halverson family, listed beside milk for infant, and no charge through September. Martha found a 1921 baptism record and a notice that the father had been injured at the sawmill that spring. A second family, the Rileys, had received ice after a cellar collapse spoiled nearly all their preserved food. Another entry described blocks delivered to a widow who stored medicine for her daughter during a fever outbreak. None of the assistance appeared in the company ledger. Clara had recorded it separately, preserving the family's dignity. She wasn't making a list of charity, Emily said as she compared 2 pages. She was making sure no one disappeared. Martha looked over her glasses, and perhaps making sure no one could later claim it never happened? Each answer produced another question. Who had authorized the free deliveries? How many workers knew? Why had Clara hidden the records instead of placing them with the town archives? The journals suggested the help came through the ice harvest house, but Clara rarely named who made final decisions. She wrote only of we, the crew, and those who could spare an hour after dark. On the 4th morning, Noah arrived with a wooden box his mother had found after he mentioned the journals. Inside lay several photographs, a cracked pocket watch, and a folded story written years earlier in his grandfather's hand. Noah read it standing beside the old pulley. His grandfather had been a child during the final years of the ice trade and remembered men arriving at homes after sunset with canvas-covered sleds. He called them the people who kept winter for summer, though Noah had always assumed it was only a family phrase. One memory described a block of ice delivered to a farmhouse where a boy lay sick with an infection. The family had no money to pay. The men left before anyone could thank them. Noah lowered the paper slowly. "My grandfather's younger brother nearly died that year," he said. "This may have been their house." Emily searched Clara's lists until she found the Anderson name beside a road matching the old family property. The note read, "Medicine, child, 6 deliveries." Noah stared at the line for a long time. "My family might be here because of this place," he said. The discovery changed him. Until then, Noah had helped because he respected old buildings and Emily's determination. Now, every repaired board carried part of his history. "You were right to save it," he told her. "I didn't know why before." Emily had left Chicago believing she was escaping a life that no longer fit. For the first time, she wondered whether she had also been moving toward something. Martha suggested they share one verified entry with a few descendants before making any broader announcement. Ben Lawson was the first person they approached. His surname appeared beside 3 deliveries in 1924 when his great-grandfather had been out of work after a broken leg. Ben read the copy twice behind the counter of his hardware store. Then he disappeared into the back room and returned with an old photograph of a thin man on crutches standing beside a woman and 2 children. "That's him," Ben said. "My father always said the family survived that summer because neighbors helped. He never knew who." The next day, Ben arrived with weather stripping, nails, and wood preservative. He set them down before Emily could ask the price. "Consider it overdue payment," he said. Word spread faster than Emily expected. Martha told one former student, who told her sister, whose family name appeared in another journal. By the weekend, small groups began stopping at the property. Emily allowed no one to handle the originals, but she displayed copies of selected entries and Clara's photograph on the workbench. People arrived carrying family Bibles, old receipts, tools, and stories passed down without explanation. An elderly man recognized the name of his grandmother, who had received ice to keep insulin cool during a hot August. A woman brought a child's wooden wagon believed to have been used for neighborhood deliveries. Each object added texture to Clara's records, and each visitor left with the startled expression of someone discovering that an old family story had evidence behind it. The attention created problems. The building was cold, parts of the floor unsafe, and too many visitors could damage the journals. Noah built a temporary railing around the weakest section, while Martha organized appointment times. Ben donated a lockable cabinet for the copies. Emily found herself coordinating people again, but the work felt nothing like managing corporate deadlines. No one was competing for credit. They were trying to return names to lives that history had reduced to silence. Late one afternoon, after the last visitors departed, a black SUV stopped beside the property. A well-dressed man stepped out, studied the lake, and walked toward Emily with a business card already in hand. He said he represented a regional development company and had heard the property was attracting attention. "I'm prepared to make this simple," he told her. "We'll buy the land immediately, cover your expenses, and pay far more than the $100 you spent." Emily looked past him at the restored wall, the old pulley, and the windows glowing above Clara's hidden records. "Why now?" she asked. The man glanced toward the shoreline before answering. "Because suddenly everyone understands this place has value." Emily held the developer's business card between 2 fingers and looked at the man standing in the snow. The offer was more money than she had expected to see again for years. Enough to recover what she had spent, rent a place anywhere she wanted, and rebuild a comfortable life without worrying about collapsing roofs or frozen pipes. For a brief moment, she imagined returning to Chicago with a clean explanation the experiment had ended. The property had appreciated, and she had made the practical choice. Then she looked through the open doorway at Clara's photograph resting beside the copied journals. "The property isn't for sale," Emily said. The man's polite expression tightened. "You may want to reconsider after you've seen the full offer. I already know what this place is worth." He glanced at the aging walls. "Sentiment has a way of becoming expensive." Emily handed back the card. "So does erasing history." He left without another word, his SUV disappearing along the snow-covered road. Emily remained outside until the sound of the engine faded. Her hands were trembling, partly from the cold, and partly from the certainty of what she had done. She had refused the easiest path back to security, yet when Noah stepped beside her and asked what happened, she felt no regret. "They wanted the land," she said. "I told them no." Noah looked toward the ice harvest house. "Good." The simplicity of his answer steadied her. Martha suggested that the growing interest in Clara's records needed direction before rumors distorted what they had found. Together they planned a public reading at the town hall. Emily worried about exposing fragile family histories, so Martha chose entries that had already been verified and avoided details that might embarrass descendants. Noah built display stands from salvaged wood, and Ben printed notices at the hardware store on the evening of the reading. Every chair in the hall was filled. People stood along the walls and crowded near the entrance. Emily waited behind a small lectern with Clara's copied pages arranged in front of her. Public speaking had once been routine, but corporate presentations had never felt this personal. She looked across the room at people whose families appeared in the journals and realized they were not waiting for entertainment. They were waiting to hear whether their past had been remembered. Martha opened with a brief history of ice harvesting, explaining how the lake, the cruise, and the storage house had supported the town before electric refrigeration. Then she introduced Emily. For a moment, Emily could not speak. She thought of the day the auction room laughed at her $100 purchase and of the silence beneath the old floor when she first found Clara's hidden records. "These journals are not about one person saving everyone," she began. "They are about ordinary people choosing not to let their neighbors face hardship alone." She read Clara's account of a late-night delivery to a family with a sick child. She read the note about ice stored for medicine without charge. She read the entry describing workers leaving blocks at a widow's home before sunrise so she would not have to ask publicly for help. The room remained completely still. When Emily finished, a woman in the front row raised her hand and said the widow had been her great-grandmother. An older man stood next and explained that his family had preserved a story about strangers bringing ice during a summer fever, but no one had known who they were. One testimony led to another. People brought forward names, memories, and pieces of family history that had never before seemed connected. By the end of the evening, the journals no longer belonged only to Clara or Emily. They belonged to the entire community. The following days transformed the ice harvest house. Visitors arrived carrying objects wrapped in blankets or stored in old boxes. A family donated a set of iron ice tongs found in a barn. Someone brought a ledger from a general store showing purchases made by harvest workers. Another person produced a faded photograph of children sitting on small ice blocks near the lake. A retired farmer arrived with a wooden sled runner his grandfather had kept for 60 years. Emily labeled each item carefully and recorded the owner's story. The building was still unfinished, but its emptiness was disappearing. Ben became one of the most reliable volunteers. He replaced damaged hinges, repaired a section of the main entrance, and brought insulation for the wall nearest the lake. When Emily tried to pay him, he refused. "My family received help from this place," he said. "I'm just returning some labor." Noah worked beside him, and the two men argued constantly about measurements while somehow completing every task correctly. Martha organized the copied records into folders and taught Emily how to handle the originals without causing further damage. The practical challenges remained relentless. Snowmelt seeped beneath one window. A support beam needed reinforcement. The power line failed twice during the coldest week of the month. Yet every problem now drew help instead of laughter. Emily found herself surrounded by people who expected nothing from her except honesty and effort. She was still tired at the end of each day, but it was a clean exhaustion, earned through work that had visible meaning. One afternoon, while Ben removed loose mortar from the rear stone wall of the underground storage room, his chisel struck something that did not sound like stone. He stopped and tapped again. The hollow response carried through the basement. Emily and Noah joined him as he brushed dust from a narrow section behind an old wooden rack. Several stones had been fitted more carefully than the others, their edges unusually straight. This was closed later, Noah said. They removed the first stone, then a second, exposing a dark cavity inside the wall. Emily aimed her flashlight through the opening. At the back rested a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth, untouched behind the stone for decades. Emily carefully lifted the small wooden box from the cavity in the stone wall, unlike the larger metal container beneath the floor. This one was surprisingly light. The oilcloth wrapping had protected it well, and only a thin layer of dust covered the lid. Noah carried it upstairs while Martha cleared a space on the workbench beside Clara's journals. The afternoon sun filtered through the old windows, illuminating the room where generations of workers had once gathered after long days on the frozen lake. Emily untied the faded cord wrapped around the box and slowly raised the lid. Inside rested a single, leather-bound notebook, several folded letters, and a cloth envelope sealed with Clara Jensen's familiar initials. Martha exhaled softly. She wanted these found separately. Emily nodded. The journals beneath the floor had preserved the history of the workers and the families they quietly helped. Whatever Clara had hidden inside this final box seemed more personal. She opened the notebook first. The handwriting matched every journal they had already studied, but the tone was different from the opening sentence. If these pages are being read, then someone cared enough to look beyond the ice itself. Emily glanced at Martha before continuing. Clara explained that the final winter had not ended because the workers lacked courage or because the lake had failed them. It had ended because the world had changed. Electric refrigeration arrived faster than anyone expected. Businesses that had depended on harvested ice for generations gradually canceled their orders. Families who had built their lives around winter labor were forced to seek work elsewhere. Clara wrote without bitterness. She accepted that progress could not be stopped. What troubled her was something else entirely. She feared that once the trade disappeared, the people who had quietly sustained the community would disappear from memory as well. The next pages answered the question that had followed Emily since discovering the missing journal entries. Clara explained why she had hidden the records instead of placing them inside the company's office. The lists of families receiving free ice had never been official business documents. The crew believed that accepting help should never become a source of embarrassment. Deliveries were often made after sunset or before sunrise. No payment was expected, and no public acknowledgement was requested. Clara worried that if the records were left with financial papers, someone might discard them as unimportant or misunderstand their purpose. She wanted future generations to remember the kindness without exposing those who had once struggled. Emily turned to one of the folded letters. It had been addressed simply, "To whoever opens this house again." Inside, Clara described her final weeks inside the ice harvest house. Workers cleaned the building one last time, repaired tools before storing them, and swept the floors even though they knew no harvest would follow. Some men cried after leaving because they understood they would never work together again. Others quietly carried unused supplies to neighbors who might still need them before locking the doors. Clara gathered every journal, every handwritten list, and every note she believed mattered. She separated them carefully. The community records went beneath the floor where Winter had always been stored. This final notebook and her letters went inside the wall, where they would remain safe even if someone discovered the first hiding place. Emily looked toward the thick stone wall they had opened only hours earlier. Clara had planned everything with extraordinary care. Martha unfolded another letter. It contained no names or dates, only Clara's thoughts about memory. Buildings fall, businesses close, even lakes change, but people remain alive as long as someone remembers how they cared for one another. Noah quietly rested both hands on the old workbench. She wasn't trying to save a company, he said. She was trying to save a way of treating people. Emily realized that every discovery now fit together. The journals, the hidden floor compartment, the carefully protected lists, and the letters all served one purpose. Clara had trusted that someday a stranger would value ordinary lives enough to uncover them. That stranger had unexpectedly become Emily. Over the following week, Martha worked with the Town Historical Society to verify additional names from Clara's records. Every confirmation strengthened the case for preserving the Ice Harvest House permanently. During the next town council meeting, residents filled the room to support protecting the building instead of allowing future development. Families spoke about grandparents whose names had appeared inside the journals. Ben described learning that his own relatives had survived difficult summers because anonymous workers refused to let neighbors go without help. Noah shared his grandfather's memories of the men who kept winter for summer. When the discussion ended, the council voted unanimously to begin the process of recognizing the Ice Harvest House as a protected historic site. Emily accepted the decision quietly. She had arrived believing she was rescuing an abandoned building. Instead, she had watched an entire town reclaim part of its forgotten identity. Late that evening, she returned alone to the workbench. The final notebook remained open beneath the warm glow of the lantern. Only one page remained unread. Clara's handwriting appeared slower than before, as though she had taken special care with every word. Emily drew a slow breath and began reading the final message. It was addressed not to any specific person, but simply to the one who would someday open the hidden box. Clara thanked that unknown reader for believing an old ice house was worth saving. Then, in the final sentence she ever wrote, she left one quiet promise that made Emily close her eyes for a moment before reading it again. If you have found these pages, then you are now the keeper of every winter we refused to let the world forget. Spring arrived slowly along the frozen lake. Snow retreated from the shoreline in uneven patches, revealing weathered docks, old wagon ruts, and the first signs of grass pushing through the earth. The Ice Harvest House stood straighter than it had when Emily first unlocked its door months earlier. The leaking roof had been repaired. The weakest beams had been reinforced. Fresh windows let sunlight spill across the worn wooden floor where generations of harvest workers had once gathered before dawn. Nothing about the building felt modern, and Emily wanted to keep it that way. Every repair had been made to preserve its history rather than erase it. The journals rested safely inside climate-controlled display cases built by Noah with guidance from museum conservators at the County Historical Society. The originals would no longer be handled by visitors, but carefully prepared copies allowed everyone to read Clara's words without risking the fragile pages. Ben finished restoring the massive entrance doors, using reclaimed timber that matched the original wood as closely as possible. Martha organized photographs, maps, shipping tools, and family donations into small exhibits that explained not only how ice had been harvested, but why the work had mattered. Emily spent long evenings labeling displays, answering letters from descendants, and carefully matching names in Clara's records with family histories that continued arriving from across the state. Word of the journals spread farther than anyone expected. Former residents returned with grandchildren to see the building they remembered only through family stories. Local newspapers published articles about the forgotten ice harvest house and the remarkable discovery of Clara Jensen's winter work journals. Historians praised the collection because it documented everyday lives rather than business transactions. Yet what moved visitors most was not the history of harvested ice. It was the quiet evidence that ordinary workers had spent years helping neighbors without seeking recognition. Emily often watched people pause before the lists of family names. Some smiled through tears after recognizing grandparents or great-grandparents. Others stood silently for several minutes before whispering stories they had heard as children but had never fully believed. One elderly woman rested her hand against the display case holding Clara's photograph and softly said, "Now I finally know who kept my mother alive that summer." Emily never grew tired of hearing moments like that. They reminded her that Clara's greatest fear had been forgotten lives, not forgotten buildings. By early winter the following year, the town prepared for something it had not celebrated in decades. A community winter heritage festival, honoring the history of the lake and the people who had worked upon it. Volunteers decorated the ice harvest house with simple evergreen garlands and lanterns instead of modern displays. Noah rebuilt a section of the old loading platform so visitors could understand how blocks of ice had once entered the building. Ben crafted wooden signs explaining the harvesting process using Clara's journals as reference. Martha organized students from the local school to read selected passages describing ordinary winter mornings on the lake. Emily watched neighbors work together exactly as Clara had described nearly a century earlier. The building had become more than a museum. It had become a gathering place again. On the morning of the festival, fresh snow covered the shoreline, much as it had the day Emily first arrived after leaving Chicago. Families crossed the frozen ground carrying cups of hot cider, while children listened to volunteers explain the enormous saws, iron hooks, and wooden sleds displayed outside. Older residents pointed toward the lake, telling younger generations where cutting lanes had once stretched across the ice. Inside, visitors moved quietly between the exhibits. Every room echoed with conversation, laughter, and memories instead of silence. Emily stood near the entrance greeting guests until Noah joined her, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. They stepped outside for a moment, looking across the frozen lake as sunlight reflected off the snow. "Quite a difference from the day you arrived," Noah said with a smile. Emily laughed softly. "Back then, I wasn't sure I'd even survive the first winter." "You almost didn't buy the place. I almost convinced myself everyone else was right." Noah looked toward the restored building where children ran beneath the old pulley while parents read Clara's journals. "I'm glad you didn't." Emily realized she was too. She had once measured success by promotions, bonuses, and office windows overlooking a city skyline. Standing beside the frozen lake, she understood those achievements had never given her the feeling she experienced now. She had not escaped her old life by running away. She had simply found work that connected her to something larger than herself. Later that afternoon, the town gathered inside the ice harvest house for a brief dedication ceremony. Martha spoke first, thanking every family that had shared photographs, stories, and heirlooms. Ben described how the journals had changed the way he understood his own family's past. Noah thanked the volunteers who had restored the building with their hands and their time. Finally, the mayor presented Emily with a simple wooden plaque recognizing her role in preserving an irreplaceable part of the town's heritage. Emily accepted it with quiet gratitude before stepping to the front of the room. She looked around at faces that had become familiar over the past year. Many had welcomed her when she was still a stranger trying to understand an abandoned building. Others had once doubted her decision to buy it. Now they stood together beneath the same heavy beams that Clara had described in her journals. "When I left my corporate job," Emily began, "I believed I was searching for a different life. I never imagined I would find hundreds of lives waiting to be remembered." She paused, looking toward the display case holding Clara's photograph. "This building taught me that history isn't only made by famous people or great victories. Sometimes history survives because ordinary neighbors quietly choose to care for one another." The room filled with warm applause. Not for Emily alone, but for everyone whose names had returned from silence. As evening settled over the lake, the last visitors slowly departed. Lantern light flickered across the wooden walls while snow drifted gently outside. Emily remained inside after everyone else had gone, walking once more through the peaceful rooms. She stopped before the final display where Clara's last journal rested inside its protective case. Beneath it lay the final page visitors always paused to read. Emily smiled and quietly whispered the familiar words before turning off the lights. Engraved beside the journal was Clara Jensen's closing message. "If you're reading these pages, it means our winter was never truly over." Emily closed the front door behind her and stepped into the crisp evening air. Knowing that leaving her corporate life had never been an ending at all, it had simply been the first step toward becoming the next keeper of a legacy that would never again be forgotten. As we come to the end of Emily's journey, perhaps the greatest treasure she discovered was never hidden beneath old floorboards or sealed inside forgotten journals. It was the quiet truth that a meaningful life is measured not by titles, salaries, or achievements, but by the lives we touch when no one is watching. Clara Jensen and the ice harvest workers were never famous, yet their compassion echoed across generations because they chose kindness over recognition. Emily thought she was leaving everything behind when she walked away from her corporate career, but in reality, she was walking toward the place where she truly belonged. Maybe that's the lesson for all of us. Sometimes, the opportunities that seem worthless to everyone else become the ones that change our lives forever. Sometimes the stories worth preserving are not about extraordinary heroes, but about ordinary people who quietly make the world a little better. And perhaps the legacy we leave won't be remembered because of what we owned, but because of how deeply we cared for others when they needed us most.